Hello everybody, welcome back. This is session 6. We're going to be discussing despondency and despair. So hopefully you all don't become completely depressed by the end of this session. We'll try and bring it around to the positive. But first we have to talk about the realities of despondency and despair. We have to talk about the realities of depression. I'm not going to go into detail about when you need to refer, like when the red flags occur. That's covered substantially in other parts of the course, so I'm not going to worry about that. But suffice to say, that all applies here, obviously. You're not going to give someone flower essences when there's a clear red flag and send them on their merry way and presume everything will be wonderful. There is an element of common sense here. But depression is something that can affect and does affect the vast majority of our populace. So it is something that you will come across in clinic, I'm sure, unless you specialise only in the positive. And so we need to take a moment to really think about what are the elements that come into play with depression. And by now, presumably, you would have learned a great deal about the biochemical aspect of the brain and how it's influenced by hormones, etc. So I won't go into detail about that. But from a philosophical point of view, from a spiritual point of view, from an energetic point of view, how is it viewed? And because depression is such a blanket term, it really encompasses lots and lots of different types of struggles that people have in life. So we can't really put it neatly into any sort of box and say, this is this kind of spiritual struggle at all times. But it is a struggle of sorts. And sometimes it's a struggle with one's own biology, and sometimes it's a struggle with questions much greater about the universe and why you're here and all of those bigger questions. And sometimes it can be situational. So depression will look and feel very different for each person, and there's always a story with it. And so in flower essences, we're interested in the story, not so much the label. So these are a couple of examples for you. Things like losing hope. We've done a couple of flowers for hope already, but the loss of hope for improvement, any kind of optimism, that can be a flag for depression. When everything feels hopeless, or perhaps there's a total loss of meaning, lack of meaning, there's a feeling of being under a dark cloud and it having been rained upon, that leaves just as quickly, like in mustard. It can be fear of failure, or failure and continual setbacks that you can't kind of make any rhyme or reason out of, and so you lose hope as a result, disheartened. So they're just a couple of examples, but every person will be different in the way that they experience depression and their triggers for depression. As a consequence, there are a lot of flowers that address despondency, and we're going to go through them one at a time, as we do. And we're going to start with crabapple. And this is a pure white flower. You won't get much whiter than crabapple. And it's almost like like it glistens. There's almost this texture that you really want to touch this flower. It looks very soft and enticing. And it's very open. You know, when we talk about expansive flowers, this is very expansive. It's completely open, laying everything out there for the world to see. And it looks so pure. we talk about pure white and the purity of white. And there's not a blemish on this flower. It looks perfect in its purity. And that doctrine of signatures is the word purity is such an important part of the crabapple story. And it's the feeling of being unclean, of being impure, of being dirty, of feeling that there's an element of self-hatred here, and that I am inherently not good enough, I'm not pure enough, I'm not clean enough, something has happened which has soiled the very nature of my soul, and I can't scrub myself clean enough. And so crabapple can be used in the acute for when there's kind of a situation that has created this sense of being unclean, being uncomfortable in their body. So crabapple, for instance, can be used in situations of physical violence, like rape, for example. Crabapple can be really useful in bringing someone back to a state of being comfortable in their physical body again, and comfortable in the expression of their physical body again. It can also be used for when there's a really distorted image of self, so when there's self-hatred. So think about eating disorders, for example, with crabapple. And there is a huge element of shame, usually, with crabapple. And there can be a really kind of rigid personality can be quite an obsessive, compulsive, almost personality, and they're wanting to control the physical body as much as possible, but at the same time hating it. So there's aspects of denial here, denial of the beauty of one's unique self, the denial of the beauty of expression of the physical self, for example. So when there's sexual revulsion, where there's frigidity, crabapple can be a beautiful one for being able to express physically the element of beauty. And crabapple types, if you think of moving on the obsessive compulsive spectrum, crabapple types can be very fussy, can be very cleanliness focused, can be preoccupied with minute details about their health. And they may present to you with a list of things that they're hyper concerned about, things that seem much bigger than they actually are in reality. But crabapples will be meticulous about their physical body. There was even a patient that didn't want their bowels to move more than once a week because it was unclean, it was unsightly. So it's this kind of almost disconnection, or wishing to be disconnected from the human experience in this physical body. And there's also a sense of being contaminated, that thoughts are contaminated, that there's a weakness associated with the dirtiness of the mind. And interestingly, when you look at the history of naturopathy and you look at the hygienists and how much they influenced naturopathic philosophy and practice of even things like nutrition and detoxing and enemas and all of those sorts of things, there was a strong emphasis on purity which came from that particular religious sect. But it was purity of body and purity of mind. And the sense of condemnation and shame which really came down from that is interesting, and it's fascinating that it's part of naturopathic history. So crabapple types can blame their feeling of being not right on one aspect of their physical body, so they can try and control that. So, for instance, weight loss, really controlling what one eats. And when one eats, feeling like it's dirty, it's filthy, the food that's being eaten is a poison, even to that extent. And that by not eating, that's purity, that's control, that's positive. And so that can be put onto a body type or a part of the personality, a part of the mind, an aspect of the mind that is inherently unclean, that they're completely not comfortable with at all. And that may be, in the case of frigidity, it may be the sexual nature or sensual nature. That may be considered unclean, it may be considered impure, it may be considered animalistic and therefore bad. And so crabapple will take this idea of perfection, take this idea of purity, and kind of blame one aspect of themselves that they need to desperately control in order to bring about this ideal of that pure white flower, purity. Crabapple can also be used for physical conditions where they feel unclean. So skin conditions, for example, psoriasis is a good example. There can be such shame associated with psoriasis, and even a shaming from society at large, which needs to be considered. Or acne is another great example of crabapple. So crabapple can be used to deal with the emotional aspects of a disease which is physically disfiguring. They also tend to be obsessed with impure thoughts or unclean body in general, and it's a real obsession. It's a real focal point. The whole life kind of revolves around these thoughts. And what's interesting about crabapple is, and I was mentioning this before in the previous session, that when you take it, just like when you're meditating, you can bring all these thoughts to the forefront of your mind in an attempt to show the distortion of thought. But sometimes that may have the effect of being overwhelming for people. And crabapple, just like forms of therapy, can sometimes be overwhelming. So it is something to take into consideration when prescribing a flower like crabapple, same with holly, that they have a strong support network, that perhaps you've referred them to an appropriate counsellor if they don't have one already, that they are supported. And you can even do preemptive work with them about self-love, around the concept of self-love, making lists of things that they truly appreciate about themselves so that it's plastered everywhere that they look, so that it kind of saturates their physical environment. Get them to ask people that they know and that they love and that they trust, what are the qualities within me that you most appreciate? And sometimes that's not the easiest of things to do, particularly if you are a crabapple type and you're convinced that people will be able to see through the facade to this truly unlovable beast that's within. But if they can do that, then sometimes that can be really helpful to begin the process gently. It's just some things to consider. You can add this, of course, to creams for something like psoriasis. If you're making up a cream, herbal cream or combined with nutrition, whatever you're doing. And of course you can put it into a bath as well, or on a compress. The next one is oak. And I always think of the beauty of a mighty oak tree. You know, the sheer expanse of an oak tree. And when you look at the flowers, they seem so tiny and insignificant compared to the expansiveness of that tree. And so you take into consideration the tree itself, because it is so magnificent and so kind of all-encompassing. When looking at the Doctrine of Signatures, that's what I remember. I remember the huge tree, and then these tiny, delicate flowers that are on this kind of, that are right at the very tips of the tree, that are just dangling down, just kind of barely there, in comparison to the mightiness of the tree. And I think of oak types in terms of that magnificent tree. I think of them as very strong, very grounded, very capable people. But sometimes they get completely exhausted. And when you are so strong, you are so capable, and you have a tendency to know within yourself that, yes, I can take on a lot. I'm a very capable person. What can sometimes happen is that you lose track of how exhausted you actually are, and you just kind of keep struggling on, keep plodding on, and presuming that that is life, that life will always be that kind of struggle, that plodding, that one foot in front of the other, just getting by, instead of kind of standing in that magnificence and being able to give from that place of being completely filled up. And when you plod on, when you keep giving, when you're exhausted, there will be frustration that builds. There may be resentment that builds. There may be a despondency and, I can't be bothered. What's the point? And these kind of stressor symptoms are signs that the body, that perhaps you're not listening to the body in the way that you should, and that you need to kind of come back and pay some attention to it, because it's kind of flagging at you that it needs a bit of help, additional help. And so the lesson of oak is, yes, you may be magnificent, yes, you may be incredibly capable, and yes, you may be incredibly strong, but it's not a weakness to say, I just need a break. I need to set my boundaries. I need to say no to this request. I need to take time for myself. That life isn't about that constant plodding on, that constant struggle against exhaustion. That it can be that spontaneous joy and that restorative place that you can then give from. And the other aspect of oak is that life can be playful, that you don't have to struggle with the day-to-day chores of life, that there needs to be an element of play, and that restores it recharges the batteries. Oak types can also do with a reminder of the difference between sleeping and relaxing, and that they're two very different things, and that both are equally necessary. So it's almost like oak needs to give themselves permission to relax and find out how they relax, because sometimes they just won't know. They haven't really thought about it. and see if they can incorporate a bit of play there as well. It removes this idea of the need to struggle through life, that life is about plodding on. And willow. When you think of willow, a lot of people think of, the wind rustling through them and then moving very easily with the breeze. The other thing to think about with willow is it's got these beautiful flowers, and the starkness even of the colour of the branches, that yellow colour, even in the middle of winter, it's still a vibrant colour. It still stands out. And it's that constant source of creativity and inspiration that the willow tree brings. And there's been people inspired just by the beauty, the draping beauty of willow. And people sit underneath willow trees to be reinvigorated. And they have that capacity to revive. And so willows need to tap into that creativity. They need to tap into that flexibility. They need to tap into that inspiration, because that helps them to deal with any resentment or self-pity, self-wallowing. So a willow type is often stuck in a victim status. This kind of cycle of kind of a downward spiral into poor me, pity me, why does this always happen to me, why me? They feel like the universe is conspiring against them. They feel like they're constantly being put upon or put down. They feel like all their efforts have been for naught all of the time, so why bother? There's no point. Willow is also kind of anger that has gone cold. So initially there may have been frustration, and there may have been aggression, and there may have been outward aspects to Willow's venting of frustrations. But after a while of not getting anywhere with that energy, oftentimes it will be swallowed. And what I mean by swallowed is that if I can't get my way by outwardly expressing this frustration, I'm going to kind of swallow it and make people feel sorry for me. And that swallowing makes the anger turn into resentment, makes it turn cold. So there's no longer the fire in the belly. It's like the light is dwindling with a willow. And there is bitterness, oftentimes. There is bitterness towards anybody else who has done well with their lives. Why did it happen to them and not me? It's because the universe is against me. It's because I was born in this way. It's because I have this unfortunate thing that happened to me way back 20 years ago that I'm still carrying with me as the reason I can't express myself currently. And perhaps you've met willow types before. They feel shortchanged by life. And so to gain inspiration, to turn that around, can sometimes be a huge ask. And it comes down to self-responsibility, which we talked a lot about. It comes down to responsibility for the choices that are being made every single day to either stay in that same pattern or to step out into the light and to share your inspiration, to share that kind of joy, spontaneous joy that is still there. You don't become less human because you stay in that state for a while. You stay with that story of victimhood for a while. It's still all there. It can still be tapped into. It's just the story is so engrossing. The story seems so real, and it seems so valid validated by all of these aspects of life. It seems to tick the box every time. The universe is against me. And so a willow type makes the decision to unplug from the story. And a way that you can start this process is through forgiveness. And there's lots of forgiveness processes that are out there, and I'll leave that to you to discover, because it's forgiveness is big. I will say this: forgiveness isn't about letting go. It isn't a passive state. Forgiveness is a very active state of love. And until you can truly love the past situation, the past individual who's wronged you, whatever it is, until you feel love when you think about that, the forgiveness is still happening. It's not a process of saying, okay, I don't want to think about it anymore, I'm just going to let it go. It is so much more work than that. And so this can be an incredible journey of self-discovery, the forgiveness process. So I really encourage you to play around with this idea. And lastly, Star of Bethlehem. Isn't this a beautiful flower? So obviously you have the purity of white there, and you have the very openness of Star of Bethlehem. But I wanted to read out one interpretation of this doctrine of signatures. And for some of you this may be a little out there, but why not be out there? We're studying flower essences, right? Okay, so the white can amplify the protective white light of the universe. There are two triangles which create a star, one pointing up, the other down. So it's balancing the merger between heaven and earth, body and soul. Under the soul's reconnecting influence, the body truly becomes the temple of the spirit. And you can look at that flower and see something entirely different, and that's totally fine. But I just wanted to maybe have a think about a totally different way of interpreting the doctrine of signatures for Star of Bethlehem. So, Dr. Bache believed that Star of Bethlehem was used for the after effects of shock. And shock has obviously a very physiological effect, and you would have all learned shock by now, if not in classes, which I'm presuming you would have, in first aid. So I won't go into that. But we're talking here more about the mental and emotional aspects of shock. What happens to someone? Where do they go when they go into shock? We're all sort of aware of that vading out sensation, that kind of glassy look that people can get in their eyes with shock. If you haven't seen someone in shock, then maybe you're not familiar with it, but that can be a really common presentation. And it's not just in the moment either. You know, it's not just in the first 10 minutes of being in shock. Sometimes that shock can last for a long period of time. Sometimes it can last for a year, for example. And there are delayed effects of shock as well that need to be considered. So, shock and the dissociation that happens is the body's way of coping with a set of circumstances that are too much, too stressful, that are too overwhelming in the moment. So the body moves into shock as a way of dealing with it. On an energetic level, the body is said to, the physical body is said to dissociate from the energetic body. It's like the soul or the spirit just moves straight into the energetic body. And from an energetic point of view, the importance of merger back with the body sometimes doesn't happen properly or at all as a way of dealing with the long-term effects of shock. So if you think of a car accident where a loved one dies, people can stay in that state of shock for a very long period of time because they're not ready to deal with the death of someone that they truly love. And so Star of Bethlehem is kind of about bringing everything back together again and helping people to kind of feel more at ease in their body again. Another thing that can happen with shock is a sense of being frozen, like you've been frozen in time. And another energetic aspect of shock is often that the cells themselves hold the memory of the shock within them. So hold that kind of frozen state within them, hold that terror, that fear, or anxiety, whatever it was before the shock. You can kind of cement that into the cells, and then that continues to play out throughout somebody's life. And so Star of Bethlehem is given to try and neutralize all of that, to try and bring someone back to be able to deal with the emotional repercussions, the mental repercussions, the spiritual repercussions, and of course the physical, in this moment of time. So Dr. Bache referred to this as the comforter and soother of pains and sorrows. He put it into rescue remedy for that reason, to kind of bring people back into balance once a major traumatic event has occurred. And remember that traumatic events to one person can seem quite trivial to another. So it's important to know the story for that person. It's important to know how they personally have been affected by that issue and not to trivialize anyone's form of trauma. Okay, so that's it for this section. We'll come back and finish off the rest of the flowers when we get back. Have a break.